Hello, everyone, and welcome to Introduction to the Salesforce Command Line Interface for Admins. My name is Marc Baseman, and I'm a Senior Admin Evangelist at Salesforce, and I'm joined by two fantastic speakers today, Kieren Jamieson and Peter Chittum. Kieren and Peter, will you introduce yourselves?
Hi, I'm Kieren. I'm the director of the Trailhead Content Engineering team at Salesforce, also a co-founder of Rad Women, and I blog at Women Code Heroes.
Hi, I'm Peter Chittum, and I am a developer evangelist. I also lead our EMEA developer relations team.
Awesome. Thanks, Kieren and Peter. So if you've attended our webinars, this should look familiar. This is our forward-looking statement. Please make your purchasing decisions based only on products and services that are currently available. And of course, we are on all of the social media, so please connect with us. We're on Twitter at SalesforceAdminsNoI. You can use the hashtag AwesomeAdmin to connect with us. We're also on Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube as Salesforce Admins, and our website, admin.salesforce.com, recently refreshed, so absolutely check that out, has all sorts of great resources, including a recording of this webinar, podcasts, blogs, and other great stuff, so definitely check that out. Yes, this webinar is being recorded. If you're watching the recording, congratulations. The recap and the YouTube video will be posted at the bit.ly URL shown here, and we'll make sure that that is also in the Trailblazer community. Spoiler alert, join the Trailblazer community. We have a great Salesforce Admins webinar group, and you can ask questions in that group, and also this is where we will post a link to the recording. So if you're not in the Trailblazer community already, jump in there, join the group, and you can ask questions, and time permitting, we will answer them at the end of the webinar. So here's what we're going to talk about today. We'll do a brief introduction of how we found our way into the command line. We're going to talk about learning the command line with a demo. Then we'll talk about using the command line with Salesforce and another demo. We'll point you to some additional resources, and again, time permitting, we'll do that Q&A at the end. So we wanted to give you all just a little bit of a picture here. We are like you. So I am an admin, and I learned the command line interface to do annoying data things. I had to deal with a lot of crummy data that was coming my way, and I basically found that the power of the command line beat even using Excel and Google Sheets. So yeah, that's how I found my way into the command line interface.
This is Kieren. I'm also an admin and an engineering manager, which means that I deal with a lot of people who do code, and also some other admins in my team. And I like to know a little bit about everything so that I can know which tools I should use, what the language is, and I can talk to my devs and admins in the language that they use. So, and because I work with team development and we use GitHub as our version control system, which we'll talk about in a bit, I want to learn the CLI so that I can use it efficiently with GitHub.
Great, and I'm a developer, but probably for the first 15 years of being a developer, I didn't really use command lines at all. The way that development worked at the time, you were much more focused on using an integrated development environment, basically a GUI for developers, and that was the kind of coding that I did. So about 5 years ago, I kind of rediscovered command lines and just how much you can do with them if you spend some time with them. And I call myself competent with command lines. I don't think I'm quite an expert, but I think competent means that I know how to look up what I need on Google when I need to solve a problem.
Great skill to have. Thank you, Kieren and Peter. So let's go over an introduction to the command line and talk about how any admin can benefit from learning the command line. So the first thing to understand is, what is the command line interface? You're probably used to interacting with your computer through the GUI, or graphical user interface, by pointing and clicking. Well, the command line interface is completely the opposite of that, is just using text commands to interface with the computer. So no fancy recycle bin with which to empty, it's literally just commands. These commands tend to be fairly short in nature based on the history of how these were developed. You can do all sorts of computer history here, but basically the memory requirements of old computers were obviously much more limited than what we have today. So the commands were relatively short, and the interface that you had to type these things on was called a teletype machine. And it turns out that they were really hard to type on. So in addition to commands being short because of memory limitations, it was also really hard to type them on the teletype interface. So anyway, I recommend if you're interested, check out some computer history of the command line. Oh, by the way, you're probably already using a command line and you don't even think of it that way. So anytime you issue a text-based command to an app, this is the form of the command line. So if you use the Finder on Mac OS or Cortana on Windows, you have done a search there, you're probably using the command line. If you use the browser address bar and just type something in there, guess what? That's a command line too. Same with Slack and Quip. If you've done a slash command like a Jiffy or an invite, that's a command line command as well. And then Google and Web, which I'm gonna show in a minute, Google Web and Gmail. And then even mentioning someone on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, Chatter counts as using the command line. So this is beyond the scope of today's webinar, but I just want to point out there's a lot of power in the Google search and in Gmail search around using some special command line parameters here. So you'll notice in the top left example, I've searched a particular site by specifying site with a colon and then admin.salesforce.com. I'm searching for the text string admin to architect, and it's going to look for that exact string because I put it in quotes. And I've anded the word Trailblazer as well. So it's going to search the admin site, looking for admin to architect and the word Trailblazer. And it found that great podcast with Eric Schubert. Same with the Gmail search below. You can see I'm looking for emails that have attachments that haven't been read and have visit somewhere in the subject. So it turned up those messages in my personal Gmail. So pretty cool, pretty powerful stuff. So again, we're not going to talk about that today, but you can do additional research. So why should you use the command line interface and not the GUI? 3 reasons. Power, very powerful. We're going to see this in the demo. Speed, it's super fast. And it's great for batch processing, basically doing repetitive tasks over and over again. And again, these are all things that you probably could accomplish in the GUI, but it's going to take you longer and just be inefficient. So use the command line. There is a learning curve, but we really, really think it's worth it. And hopefully after today's session, you'll get a good sense of why. So let's talk about learning the command line and some actual commands that you might use. So how does the command line work? Basically, there's some input sometimes, not necessarily always. Then there's some kind of a typed command, and then there is output that comes from that command. So let's see a command. So this is a very simple command called date, which returns, surprise, the date. Here is the command, and you can see we've given the command some arguments or parameters here, and most arguments and parameters have abbreviations. So in this case, the date, we've specified that we want this in universal time, and it gives us the output of, in this case, not today's date, but the date that we ran this command. But you can use this. And where you type the commands in depends on the operating system that you're using. So we'll talk about this a little bit later, but in the Mac interface, you're going to use the terminal program, and in Windows, you're going to use PowerShell. So, and if you're using Unix, then I don't know why you're on this webinar, because you probably know all that you need to know about the command line. So here are some important commands for you all to know. This is by no means a comprehensive list of commands. There are obviously way more commands that can fit on a single slide. Again, these are the bash family of commands. So again, if you're using Mac or Unix, these are the commands that you'll use. In Windows, you can use some of these commands, but not all of these commands, and I'll show you the Windows commands in a second. But I just want to go through this list to kind of give you some idea of what kinds of things you can do. So you can see there's some kind of navigation commands and searching of things. So moving around the file system, CD, change directory, show where you are right now, pwd, print the working directory, display what's in a directory. You'll notice I've given some examples here on the right. Notice that some of these commands actually have parameters as well, and you can see the ls-al. So in this case, it's show me -all and show me the list view, I believe. Long. Show me the long view. Thank you. Appreciate that, Kieren. So a bunch of other commands here. So you can see kind of the usual navigation, copying, moving files, deleting files. But then we get down to some of the more interesting stuff at the bottom. So grep, sed, cat, and echo. So grep, global regular expression print. Okay, so what the heck is that? Look for a file with text in it that matches a particular pattern. Okay, this seems interesting. We're going to see more of this in the demo, but basically this is, hey, I'm looking for a specific thing in a file. Interesting. And I don't have to look just for a text string. I can look for patterns, which is pretty cool. Sed, this is the stream editor. This allows you to do things like find and replace text. So you're used to working with files probably. Well, what's great is you can use sed to change things in memory even before committing it to a file. So we'll point that out in the demo. And then cat. This allows you to concatenate two files. So basically it's, here's my file, here's my other file, concatenate them, put them together. And again, there are some other commands, and we're going to show more of those in the demo. And then echo just displays the text on the screen. So you'll notice here in PowerShell, there are some commands. You'll notice that these commands are more descriptive and in fact longer, so they're longer to type. You can tell that these commands were created essentially much later in time. So set location, get location, select string, right? These are a little bit more descriptive about what they actually do. But for the old school computer folks who couldn't be bothered to remember the names of these long commands / didn't want to type them all, you can see there are some aliases to some of the similar commands that you saw in the Mac and Bash commands, right? The cd, pwd, cp, mv, all that stuff. But again, the same idea here. So I want to show you some of the operators. So these are the things that happen between commands. So in this case, the semicolon is do the first thing, then do the next thing. So cd, pwd, that's going to change the directory and then print the working directory that you're in. The pipe, so this is the kind of vertical bar. This says to take the output from the first command and send that into the second command. So you can see the first command is cat names.txt, and then take that and put that into the sort command. So in this case, if you just cat one file, it essentially does the same thing as echo. It shows you that file on screen. So instead of concatenating two files, so I could have done cat names.txt and names2.txt and then piped that into sort. So same idea. Redirect. So this is pretty cool because this basically takes output from the first command and then writes it immediately to a file. So this is the greater than symbol. So in this case, our first command here is echo text1. So that would take that all to the screen, and then I'm going to redirect that into my file.txt. Just be careful, and I'll say this kind of just generally for all the file related commands in the command line. There's not something friendly like, are you sure you want to overwrite this file? Are you sure you want to delete this file? There is no confirmations like perhaps you're used to in the GUI land. This assumes that you want to do all the things. So when we talk about great power comes great responsibility, guess what? You can do a lot of damage with the command line. So just be aware that it's not going to ask you for things like confirmations for file deletions and overwriting. Writing the output from the first command. So this is the kind of double greater than sign. This is the append, and we're going to see this in the demo here as well. But again, this is take the first command and then add it to the end of the second thing. So in this case, if I echo text2 to my file, so that's going to append everything that's in text2 to the end of my file, which if you remember the first one, that has the content of text1. So my file will now have text1 and then text2 at the end. Double ampersand. So this is sort of like the semicolon, but it only does the second command if there's no error on the first one. So if you're kind of worried about whether the first thing is going to work and you don't want to try to do the second thing unless the first one works, then that's what the double ampersand was. So essentially it's the semicolon with some extra logic built in. So cat file.txt is going to show me that file and then remove file.txt. So again, if there's no error on the cat, then it'll remove the file. So this is just a little bit of a dictionary of those operators. I just want to point out a couple of other important features here, which are the command line using the tab can help you auto-complete what you've started typing. That's super handy. So this is things like commands or directories, those sorts of things. Control-C allows you to stop a process that's not ending on its own. So if for some reason you type something and you're just sitting at a screen and you're waiting and nothing seems to be happening, just press Control-C, and it is Control even on a Mac. And then the up and down arrow show you the history of your typed command. So when you use the up arrow, you'll be able to see in your history, it's going to bring up the previous command that you typed. So it's pretty handy. So here are a couple of recipes of the command line. I'm not going to go into super detail here, but I just wanted to show you some, combinations of commands, because really the power of the command line is not just in just one of the commands. It's in combining all these commands into, really cool recipes. So if I look at the first one, the ls-la, and you can see it's redirecting that into the files.txt. That's going to show me all of the files in the directory and folders in a directory, and then it's going to redirect the output of that into a files.txt text file, which will give me a text file of all of the stuff that's in a particular directory. So you can see how that might be useful. Let's say you have a bunch of data files in a directory, and you're like, man, I don't even know what's there. And if you very quickly want a file, here's the list of all the data files I have. That's the way to do it. CD, PWD, we talked about earlier. Let me point out the two greps here. So grep old file.csv. So it's looking for the text string old in my CSV file. Then it's using the pipe. So it's going to take the output of all the lines. Then it's going to use the stream editor for, hey, look for the string old and replace it with the string new. And then it's going to redirect that into a cleaned.csv file. So you think of each of these things as kind of a chain, if you will, of commands. It's now going to give me a new cleaned.csv file with everything, with essentially all the words old replaced with the word new. Okay, this grep command here, it looks insane, but we found this on the internet, so it must work and be amazing. But basically, this is looking for valid email addresses, looking for wonky email addresses. So Peter is going to go through a little bit more detail in this command and give you some insight here. But basically, it's looking for a text string, then a dot, then an email address, then the @ sign, and then a domain. So anyway, the final one here, head, gets me the first, in this case, the first line of a particular file, and then cat, and so on. So it concatenates that first line into the top of file 2, and then creates a new file 3. So you can see, like, maybe you have a header in a file, and so on and so forth. Okay, so let's get into the demo. So I'm going to turn it over to Peter to talk us through the demo.
Cool, excellent. Thanks, Mark. So the demo that we're going to go through is to try and take what is a pretty common process, I think, for admins, where you have some lead data that's coming in, that's maybe being scanned in, and we need to clean that up because we don't want to import some bad data. So I'm going to show you how to do this with command line commands. But before I actually get to those command line commands, I want to just kind of step back from the actual process and show kind of a fun way of understanding how these all work. So let's get to the demo, and we will show how all this works. Okay, there's the show my screen. All right, and one of the things Mark mentioned is that command lines are everywhere. And in fact, the way that I use my Mac, I rarely use my mouse at all because I usually launch everything from the Spotlight search. If I just do Command space, I get that Spotlight search bar, and I can then go and open my terminal, which is where I'm going to actually use the command line, and I didn't even have to take my hands off the keyboard. And what I have to say is that for me, one of the things I love about command lines is that I just don't want to use my mouse. I can be faster and more productive if I can use my keyboard and the tab key and all that kind of stuff. All right, so here I am. So a couple of bits of context to set here. First of all, I'm on a Mac, as I said. The shell that I'm using, or the command line app that I'm using, is called Z shell. If you're in the UK, you might call it Z shell. And I use that because some of the things that Marc described, the up arrow through history and the tabbing, they're a bit more powerful than bash, which is the standard command line that you would get with with a Mac. Bash is great. I used it for many years. And then once I got good enough with the command line, I found that Z shell had more features that I wanted to use. So I'm not going to actually interact with the org in this demo. I'm going to do that in the second demo. And as I said, I want to start by just taking a look at how these commands work with text files. And so if I show what's in my directory with the ls command here, you can see there is a file called forwardlooking.txt. I can also see where I'm at. Marc showed that as well, and that's pwd. So you can see this is the nesting of all of the folders in my file system, which is where I'm at. Now, if I want to see the contents of that forwardlooking.txt, as Marc said, you can use the cat, the cat command. And what I just did there that made it just pop into place was I hit the tab key. And with cat forwardlooking.txt, I can see the contents of forwardlooking.txt, which some of you might have guessed is the forward-looking statement, because we all love the forward-looking statement. And so why am I using the forward-looking statement? Well, I think it's kind of a fun way to look at some of these things. So remember, cat is actually concatenate. And so if I do cat, so let me clear. I'm going to clear my screen a lot just so it pops it up to the top. So if I cat forwardlooking.txt to forwardlooking.txt, I actually get two forward-looking statements all kind of run together. You can see that's the last line of the first one, and then there's the first line of the second instance of that. And the fun thing is I can just do this forever and ever if I want to, but I'm not going to. What I do want to show is I want to show a couple of other commands. So cat, you can output the contents of a file, or you can concatenate two things together. The next one I want to show is head. So maybe I want to see the first few lines of a file. So head minus n5 forwardlooking.txt, and you can see that there's the first 5 lines of my forward-looking statement. And then I can take that and I'm going to put that to a file called shorter.txt. And now if I cat shorter.txt, you can see there are those 5 lines. In fact, if I show my directory contents again, you can see that there are those 2 files again. Now, so head shows me the top n number of lines of my file. It has a counterpart to show the bottom n number called tail. There it is, minus n5. So it works the exact same way with how many lines I want to show. And again, I will say forwardlooking.txt. And so there we go. So those are the last 5 lines. And the fun thing is then, as Marc showed, I can append this onto shorter.txt. And now I have a 10-line abbreviated version of the forward-looking statement, which is completely not okay with Salesforce Legal. So before I move on, I'm just going to remove that file so that Salesforce Legal are going to be happy with me. All right. So those are a few really basic commands to work with text files. Outputting the text, concatenating text files, seeing the first few lines, seeing the last few lines. Now, Marc also talked about some other commands that are more advanced in that they can look at the contents of the file or the contents of memory and search for data in that or change data in that. So if I want to search for data in a file, I'm going to use the grep command for that. And for my grep command, what would be a good word to search for in the forward-looking statement but the word statement?
That seems right.
Yeah, there we go. So you can see now that the way that grep has searched for that, it's only returned the lines that match the pattern of the word statement. So it's a really straightforward one. Now, in addition to that, maybe I want to take this a step further, and I'm tired of statements. Maybe I want to make these something else. So I'm going to pipe. Remember, the pipe symbol passes the output from the one command, and then it passes it into the next command. And it's really important to reiterate here, all of these things that are being output to the console are just sitting around in memory. They only get written to the file system when and if I tell it to. So forward-looking.txt, we're going to look for the word statement, and on those lines, we're going to use the stream editor, or sed, to do a substitution of the word statement for the word. Marc, why don't you come up with a word that we can substitute there?
How about admin?
Ooh, admins. Can we make them awesome admins?
Yes,
Okay.
I allow.
All right. All right. So we're going to substitute the word statement for awesome admins. And now we can see, and actually the way that I did that we're just going to say awesome admin. That works a little bit better. Now it's kind of hard to pick those out. So if I just pipe that back to grep and look for awesome admin, I can see all the instances where statement has been replaced by awesome admin. Now, one thing though is that you'll notice that this one hasn't been. And the reason for that is that the way that the stream editor, or sed, works is that it will only replace the first instance it finds on any given line. And so if I want to do it globally on any instance on that line, I have to add the G flag on the end of that. And now you can see that everywhere where it said statement before, I have awesome admins. So that gives us a little bit of a taste of how these commands work. Let's actually now apply them to a real life scenario. So I'm going to change to my next demo directory. And again, I'm just using things like tab and to look for things in the file system. And this is one of the things I really love about Z Shell, is that it takes what is something that you used to have to know all of the names for things, and it makes it super easy to access them. All right, so in here, in my demo2 directory, there's a header.csv, which I'm going to come back to, and the leads.csv. And what we've learned is that this leads.csv has some bad email addresses, and it has some other bad data, specifically in the, I think the status, it's not status, but we'll see it in a moment. So what I'm going to do is, of course, I could cat leads.csv, but that's not really very readable, in fact. One thing that makes this easier to read is that there's an open command, and if I do open leads.csv, the way that a Mac will work is it will find the default app to open that file, and it will open it for you. So in this case, it opens that CSV here, and actually it is rating that we have the bad data. See where it says ice cubed and warm, and freezing rather, those should be cold. Somebody was getting creative with their rating values. So we'll close that and we'll do a little bit of a cleanup. All right, so first thing we're going to do is we're going to grep, and now this is that gnarly email address regular expression that Marc showed earlier. And what I just did here was I hit the up arrow, and one of the features of using Z Shell is that it will go back through your history, and if you start to type a command, it'll find the most recent command that matches that in your history. So grep -e, the -e is just saying use an extended version of regular expression so we can do more advanced pattern matching. And we're going to match this pattern on every line of leads.csv. And basically this bit here, that's going to, the first bit before the @ symbol, that's that part of your email address that is basically your local name. And then everything here is the domain. So whether that's salesforce.com or something else, that would be that part of the email address. And what we can see when I run this is that it very handily matches all of the good email addresses. But what we need to do, because we really want to verify this, are there any bad email addresses? Let's see if we can clean those out here. So I'm going to pop to there and -v. By adding the -v flag, it says only show lines that don't have a match it to this pattern. And so you can see that we get 2 lines back. Now the first one is very clearly the header, which makes sense. The header shouldn't necessarily have email addresses. The second line, however, right there, you can see that that email address, dzuko@Paper Street, that's not a valid email address. So for that reason, we don't want that. Well, the good news is the first command I did gives me exactly what I want. It gives me this grep -e, right? So it matches any good email address lines, and it's going to output that. Now, at the same time, we saw that there was some other bad data. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the output of this grep command, so all my good lines where I have good email addresses, and I'm going to use Stream Editor again. And with Stream Editor, I'm going to substitute, what was it, ice cubed. We're going to make that cold. And then I'm just going to run Stream Editor a second time where substitute freezing is cold. And with that, I should have my good data, my cleaned data. Now, probably normally I'd want to write this to a file and double check, but I want to just get a move on and get this totally good to go. So the last thing I need to do is I need to put the header back on. If you recall the way that the regular expression works, it's actually going to remove the header line from my CSV. And that's why I stuck that other header file out there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use cat. So another pipe, and unfortunately it wraps at the bottom there, but I'll do cat. And then what do I want to cat? The first thing that I want is header.csv. Now the second thing I want is my clean data in the stream. And when Marc was showing this in the slide, you saw that there was a dash. And by applying the dash in the cat command, it just says take whatever is being piped into this command and put it there. So I could actually put the piped data at the beginning or the end, or if I have 3 or 4 things, anywhere in there. So last thing now, I'm going to write this to a file and call it leads import.csv. And now if I open leads import.csv, I should see that I have the data that I want. So if I look at the bottom, I'll see that Darlene Zuko has been cleaned out, and I also have good rating values here at the top. And just like that, with a few commands, I've been able to clean my data. How's that?
That's amazing. So, so now that Peter and Marc have shown you some of the basic commands for the CLI, let's take a look at one that is built specifically for Salesforce, and that is the Salesforce CLI. So the Salesforce CLI is a program that you install on your computer, and it allows you to work with all of your Salesforce orgs. And through it, you can create and manage not only sandboxes, but also a fairly new type of org called a scratch org. We'll talk about that later. If you have multiple orgs that you log into, perhaps a production org and a sandbox or 2, then it's easy to launch them directly from the Salesforce CLI, which is really helpful. Stops you having to log in and log out with your credentials. You can also use the Salesforce CLI to get data in and out of your org. And we can even check things like how we are regarding governor limits in our org. So how do you install the CLI? Well, it's actually fairly easy. You will provide this slide deck, and you will just click on the appropriate link there and download and install those programs. And then you can test it out by opening your terminal window or your PowerShell and typing SFDX, which is basically the command that says, wake up Salesforce CLI, I'm talking to you. And then you use the command update, which will grab the latest version of the Salesforce CLI and install it on your computer. If you already have the latest version, it's just going to show you that is that it's up to date. So we mentioned earlier that there's an org called a scratch org, and I wanted to spend just a little bit of time about what it is and why, as an admin, you might want to use it. So we're used to point and click workflows where we develop our content in a sandbox, and then we use change sets to push it to production. If you work in a team environment, then you may have multiple sandboxes that you use, and you're syncing all of that data to a version control system like GitHub or GitLab. And then you can, once all of those configurations are consolidated, then you can send them to your production org. Well, there's another way, and so that's the top workflow in blue. But let's look at another fairly new way that you could use, excuse me, scratch orgs to work in a team environment. But before we get into that workflow, I just want to talk a little bit about what scratch orgs are, because they're pretty cool. They're often used in team development, where you have multiple admins or developers working on new features in your production org, and you can use them in conjunction with a version control system, just like you would with sandboxes. But scratch orgs are dedicated, configurable, and short-lived, up to about 30 days, or up to 30 days, Salesforce orgs. And by default, they're blank versions of your org without any of your customizations. But you can load your customizations using a definition file when you create your scratch org. So they can have configurations, or they might not. Once you've created the scratch org, you can load them with your configuration files, as I said, and then you can choose to load up some test data if you want. And then you push all of that to your version control system in the form of a package, and then you can deploy that package to your production org. So let's talk a little bit about this word dev hub. And Peter's going to show you about dev hubs in a minute. But dev hub, you need a dev hub because you only get a certain number of active scratch orgs at any given time, and so to keep track of them, you have to have a dev hub. For most people, you turn your production org into a dev hub, and it just installs a couple of objects, and it keeps track of everything for you. So let's look at how you would spin up a scratch org using a CLI. So the first thing you're going to look at is you're going to see the wake up command, SFDX. Hey, I'm talking to you, SFDX. And then you're going to have some other commands, force, org, create. So as you can imagine, that creates an org. -F is saying there's a file path for a definition file, and you can see the path for the definition file, and then you can optionally tell it how many days you want this scratch org to live for. And by default it's 7 days, but you can have up to 30 days. And then once you run this, in a few minutes you have a scratch org that has all of these customizations. It's really cool and very fast. So let's talk about the scratch org definition file. So we said that scratch orgs come by default and as a blank kind of clean slate, and that we use this definition file, which is a JSON file, which is just a fancy text file. It's formatted in a particular way, and we use that to load up configurations. And you can have different configuration files for different scratch orgs. So as an admin, what's interesting to me is that we might have different ways that we're maybe testing out page layouts, or we're testing out a process, and we want to see how it works in reality, and we want to try, you know, version A in one scratch org and version B in another. You can do that with scratch orgs because you can have a different definition file for every scratch org. So this is an example of a definition file. I'm not going to go into too much detail. We have a resource at the end that will show you how this is all put together, but you can see that it's basically key value pairs. And sometimes there's one value for the key, like an org name with Acme. Sometimes there's multiple, like in line 4 with features. And sometimes there's whole sets that are nested in there. So if you look at lines 6 through 10, those are some examples. So the cool thing about the Salesforce CLI for me as an admin is that it allows me to get data out of my org without actually having to open it and run a report, create a report, run it, export it, and so forth. I can just go straight to the data, which is really cool. So Suckled is how we do that. Suckled stands for Salesforce Object Query Language. It has three main parts. The first is defining the select statement, defining what fields you want. The second is the from, which is what object those fields are in. And then the third is your where statement, where it's kind of like report filters. It filters the data and gets you just what you want. And you can run this directly in Suckled. Sorry, in the Salesforce CLI. So here we have our wake up command SFDX. Then we're telling SFDX that we want to pull some data. So that is force data Suckled query. Then we have some commands there, which is -R. I want to put this into a CSV file. Then we have -Q, which is saying, okay, here's the query that I want to run. It's the same on the previous slide, which is select the ID and the name from the account object where the shipping state is either CA or NY. And then I want to redirect, so I want to save that data to a file called accounts.csv. So here are some of the other options of commands that you can do, and I've bolded here the category of the command, because when you go to the Salesforce CLI command reference, which I recommend you all do, it's actually very well written. As an admin, sometimes I find the developer documentation a little harder to understand because it's not my language, but this is actually pretty easy to understand, I think. The first four commands are integrating with your org. So logging in to an org, listing out all of the active orgs that you've logged into, creating an org, and creating an alias. Now, an alias is just a way of nicknaming an org. So it allows you to open up or interact with that org without having to know your login credentials. So it's pretty cool. The next two, we talked about the Suckled query. The next one, data record update, is updating a single record. And in that, you would tell it what you want to update, which object that lives in, and so forth. And then the last one displays the limits for your org. So some of the useful CLI parameters I've got listed here. Now, they do depend on the command that you're using. So some of these will work with some commands, but not others. But in general, -H, it's the same thing in the CLI. -H always brings up the help for the command that you're looking for. So if you get confused about what is available, then you can look at that. -S, I said before that you could update a record. This is how you tell it which object that you're going to be updating. -U says which username you're going to be signing in as. -Q, we talked about, is the Suckled query that you want to run. -F references a particular file path, so that might be for a definition file or it might be something else. -I is the external ID, so if you're doing an upsert, which updates or inserts depending on whether the record actually exists in your org, you need to tell it which field is the external ID. And then if you want to set the output, instead of being CSV, maybe you want JSON, then -JSON is one of the ways to go. So let's look at some recipes. The first one we have here is we want to create a list of all of the private reports and dashboards that we haven't run in a year. And I think I'm going to leave that to Peter. I believe that we're going to look at that soon. If you have an existing Sandbox and you want to create an alias with it so that you can use it more easily, then that's the command that you would use. Force alias set, and then you name what the Sandbox is, and then the equal signs, and then your username that you use to log in. And then it will authorize, you'll have to put in your username and password, and then from then on, you are authorized on this computer to use just that nickname, that alias, to interact with that Sandbox. There's a couple of other things here about how you can clone a Sandbox, either with a definition file or without a definition file. And then the last one there is upserting data using a CSV file. So what we're doing there is we're saying, hey, I want to update in bulk, and the object that I want to use is my object. It's a custom my object. The file path of the CSV file is, and here's the file path, and the -I is, here's the external ID to say, hey, if this ID exists for a record in the database, then update it. If it doesn't exist, then create a new record. So, Peter, you're up next.
All right, so for this demo, I want to go through a set of Salesforce command line commands and have you understand, hopefully, how you can get started with it as well. So I'm going to start by actually just showing you how can you find out what commands are there. If you're using a command line with Salesforce, you need to connect to Salesforce. I'm going to show you how to do that. And then I'm just going to go through a couple of use cases on once you're connected, what could you do? So let's pop over to the demo. And now, again, some context setting. Now, in the last demo, I'm sure noticed that I was running a Mac. And in this demo, I am in Windows land. One thing that I found, I've been talking to people about adopting the command line for probably almost 3 years now. And what I found is a lot of people, if you don't show them the command line in their operating system, they can sometimes switch off a little bit. So I thought, why not show a demo that bridges the gap between Windows and Mac and do one of each. All right, so as Kieren said, SFDX is the engine behind the Salesforce command line. And if you take a look at that, you can see that there are different commands and there are topics. And in fact, force is a command. And the way that the command line works is that SFDX is the command line, and all these other things like force are just plugins. And all that means is that they're little modular bits of software that the SFDX command can run. And I just like showing this because I love ASCII art, and who doesn't love a Salesforce cloud in ASCII art? What's really helpful, though, if you do SFDX force and then -H, you will see all of those topics that Kieren was talking about that are available. And if you take any one of those topics, so maybe force data and add a -H on that, same thing, you're going to find out all of the subtopics. So in this way, you can kind of explore through the hierarchy of all the different commands. On the other hand, what if you just want to see the big list of all the commands that are out there? Well, one of the commands, SFDX force doc, commands list. That's actually going to spit out every single command option. Now, that could be a little bit overwhelming, but if you recall, the command line has tools for this. Now, in the Mac world and using Z Shell and Bash, there was something called grep. Grep doesn't exist in PowerShell, but it has an analogous or a similar function called select string. So if I just do that same last command and then I pipe, so pipe works the same in PowerShell that I'm using right here in Windows as it does in Z Shell or Bash. And if I pipe that to select string, and then I look for the pattern of, what am I looking for? Let's say data, so colon, data, colon. That's going to show me all of the commands that use the word that are the topic data. And now I can kind of get a sense overall, what are the data-oriented commands that I can work with? Now, as we've said, working in Salesforce in a command line isn't going to be useful unless you connect to an org. And the command for that is SFDX force auth for authorization, web login. In other words, we're going to use a standard web login in order to authorize ourselves in Salesforce. Essentially, this command launches our browser. Now, what are the parameters that we can do with this? Again, I can just pop a -H on here. And you can see here that I have some options as far as what I can do. Now, the first one I want to show out is here, this -A, alias. So alias basically is that once I authorize, I want to create a shortened name for accessing this org. And that way, each time I reconnect to it, I have less stuff to type. Now, Kieren also was talking about the dev hub. And if I want this to be my default dev hub, I have a -D option there. Right? So that one there can make sure that this one is registered as a dev hub, and then any commands that I issue that need a dev hub, like for creating a scratch org, that will automatically default, and I don't have to specify it at all. Defaults are great. Now, if I'm connecting to a Sandbox, Kieren, Marc, who wants to take a guess? What's different about logging into a Sandbox versus logging into a production org?
Oh, you have to log in with test dot instead of login.salesforce.com.
Boom! Kieren wins that one, and there we go. So I need to use instance URL if I want to log into a Sandbox with this command. Okay, so that gives me some idea of how I'm going to use this. And what I'm going to do in this instance is I'm actually going to log into my production org. So SFDX, oh, actually I can just do up arrow, and I can get rid of my -H. And then I can do -A for my alias, and I'm just going to call it prod for short. And then finally, I am going to use this as my dev hub, so I'm going to use that -D. And since I'm logging into production, I don't need to specify any different authorization URL. So I'm going to enter that in, and that's going to launch my browser. Now, once I get to my browser, of course, I'm just going to log in as I would normally. There's Peter at DX Hub, and I'll put in my super secret password and finish the login process. Now, if you've ever used the Salesforce mobile app, you'll know that you don't have to enter in your credentials every single time, right? Well, this is very similar. When I register my Dev Hub, it's actually going to store an authorization token so that I can reconnect to my Dev Hub without entering my credentials each time. And so once I've done this authorization, you'll notice here it comes in and says you've successfully authorized, you may now close the browser, and then I can use SFDX force org open -u prod. So there I am using that alias there, and I can log into my org directly from my command line. Now, you want to be really careful when you do that with your production org, but how many people have 3 or 4 or 10 sandboxes or developer edition orgs? Imagine how easy it is to actually just get to any org you want to using that little trick right there.
Very
okay,
good.
So you like that? Is that a winner? All right, so let's also do a couple of other things. Now, obviously, there's a lot of data that we can look at in the org, so force, limits, API, display. So that's going to show me, oops, except I need to tell it which org to connect to. Yeah. All right, and then I can see what my current org usage is. And again, that's a lot of stuff, so maybe you want to just pipe that to the select. Actually, I'm going to use the alias SLS for select string, pattern, and then we're looking for, let's look for API limits. All right, so I can see here my daily API request is looking pretty healthy, and I'm pretty much not using any of the other ones, but that's fine. All right, so we can actually access really quickly things like our limits. And one thing that you might want to do is actually create a sandbox. So for creating a sandbox, Kieren talked about this, is SFDX force org create. And then in this instance, I would go in and create a brand new sandbox that would basically be the typical copy of my production org. Now, all of the sandbox commands are in beta, including a new one called clone. Now, the clone command is kind of cool because what I can do is I can say the type is sandbox, and I want to create this sandbox in my production org. In other words, it's a sandbox based on my production. And then I'm going to wait for a certain amount of time to actually do that. But then the cool thing is I can give my sandbox name here in the command line. I'm going to call this SBX5 in this instance. And then I can also go in and I can have this based on not my production org, but another sandbox. So this is going to be source sandbox name equals LTNGSBX1. Now that sandbox is one of the new Lightning Developer Pro sandboxes. So that's what that is. And then I can kick that off and leave it to go in, and eventually it'll come back and say that it's completed building the sandbox. All right, now the last thing I want to show, I'll take about 1 minute, and then we have about a few minutes left for Q&A. And that is, I want to show how can I find the reports that are in private directories, or private folders rather. So this is a data command, sfdx force data sockle query. Now, -q is where I can specify the query. And then I can say select ID from report. And using scope, all private. This command here will actually go out and look for just private reports. And again, I forgot to pass in my username. So -u prod. And there we go. Now you can take this, and in the slides, there's an example of how you can extend this query with a filter that says, only show me reports that haven't been run in the last year. And then using this, you can pass it into something like Data Loader to do a delete on those reports. All right, so there we go. A real quick tour through a bunch of commands. Hopefully everyone can find a few things that are useful to them as admins in those commands.
Fantastic. Thank you, Peter. That was great. And hopefully that gave folks a great taste of what you might want to do here. So very brief summary. The command line can help you do things quickly. You're probably already using them. You can use them to interact with files and settings on the computer. With the Salesforce CLI, you can access, interact with data and metadata in your Salesforce orgs. Command lines have two basic parts, the command and the optional parameters. You can chain them together. People generally have a few key commands that they use often, like recipes. And you can use the Salesforce CLI to spin up new Scratch orgs and sandboxes, import and export data, view limits, and so on. And Scratch orgs are temporary Salesforce orgs, which are great for team development. And I'll head off one of the questions here, which is why you would use a Scratch org instead of a sandbox. A Scratch org is good for working particularly with developers, and you can enable additional features in your Scratch org that maybe you don't have enabled in your sandbox or your production environment. There are a bunch of resources that are out there around the Salesforce command line and using Git and GitHub, which we didn't really get into today because we didn't have time, but around version control and you working with a team. So great resources on Trailhead. And of course, there will be more content at Dreamforce, so keep your eyes open for that. And there's some additional resources here to just get started with both the command line in general and the Salesforce command line. Obviously, we have a ton of documentation for you, some in Trailhead and then some in our developer space. So definitely take a look there. So again, in the admin webinar group, you'll find the recording of this. There will be a survey following this, so please let us know what you thought of this content. We kind of dipped our toes in some more advanced content here, so we would love to hear what you think. And of course, the slides and the recording will be available at the bit.ly URL there. So with that, thank you for your time. I'm just going to do a quick refresh here and see if there are any new questions that have come in. Helena, I hope I've answered your question about using the sandbox. Yes, you definitely need to install the command line interface before you can use it, Samantha. So make sure to install the Salesforce command line. It won't just work out of the box. You need to use the installer first before you can use the sfdx command. Otherwise, you'll get an error. I am not seeing any more questions come in here on the Trailblazer community. So with that, I think I'm gonna have us wrap up today. So Kieren and Peter, thank you so much for joining us. Hope this was great content for you all. And yeah, thanks so much.